Hello, Bible Geeks. Ryan Schumacher here. We are here with week 3 of the foreknowledge series. We are talking today about the divine decree model of foreknowledge. So again, this series is what does God know and when does he know it? Talking about foreknowledge, human freedom, and the problems of suffering. And we're going through 4 models of how God might know the future, investigating the ways that theologians have answered these questions for millennia. The 4 models are coming from, they're, I think, the 4 typical models that you'll find out there. There are a few books that we referenced early on, divine foreknowledge, 4 views, divine providence, 4 views. Generally speaking, you're talking about the simple foreknowledge view, which we talked about last week, and then the divine decree model. Another way of describing that would be meticulous providence, or the Reformed or Calvinistic view. Then you have the open model, and then the middle knowledge or Molinist model. So we're looking at all 4 of those, and this one here we're focusing on the model of God's eternal decree. So what we're going to be going over today, we're going to have another pop quiz at the beginning. I'm kind of liking these. Then we're going to go through a definition of the divine decree view, and then looking at biblical data that supports the idea of God's sovereign decree of everything in history. The points are going to be that God is the sovereign over all of history, and God has holy and just purposes in every single event that takes place in time. And then, just like we did last week, we're going to be taking it through what I'm calling the theological stress test. We're going to ask some questions of this view. And in particular, on this week, the questions we're going to focus on are, is God the author of sin? If God is controlling everything, is God the author of sin? And then the other one saying, wait, don't we have free will? We're not robots. What do you mean that God controls all of history? So again, we're sharing these different models, and we're looking at their support, and then we're running them through the theological stress test to see how they hold up. Then on the other side, we're going to see how they interface with these specific questions of human freedom and the problem of suffering. All right. And what I'm hoping for is that my computer is going to comply. So we're going to start with another one of these pop quizzes. I suppose a pop quiz is a quiz you're not expecting. And at this point, if I tell you about it, and I've done it 2 weeks in a row, now you're expecting it. So maybe I'll just call it the survey or the quiz in the future. First question. These are primer questions. I want you to answer for yourself, yes or no. Is God free? You might find that a strange question. But as we go through the next few questions, you might want to come back and think about your answer to this one. Is God free? The answer does appear to be obvious. I think it is. But we're establishing some premises here. So is God free? Okay. How about am I free? So once again, I'm deliberately not not defining the word freedom. It just, however you think that question would mean, is God free? Am I free? So answer yes or no. Then, are my will and God's will always aligned? Answer yes or no here. If yes, please reach out to me and email. I would like to meet you. You're the holiest person that has ever walked the planet since the Messiah himself. You may be the second coming, and I'd like to get the scoop on that one first. This one is intended to be, again, kind of a leading question. Hopefully most people who are, or all people who are Christians will understand that this is not the case. But that sets the stage for the next question. And it's kind of a separate question. And it's one I really do want you to ponder. So is God free? Am I free? Are my will and God's will always aligned? These are not intended to be trick questions. All right. So when my freedom opposes God's freedom, whose wins? Mine or God's? Think about this. This is not an unfair question. You answered these questions here. Is God free? Yes or no. Am I free? Yes or no. Are my will and God's will always aligned? Yes or no. Okay. So if you answer yes, yes, yes down the line here, then you need to answer this question. It's not a meaningless question. You can't really escape it, because my will and God's will are not always aligned, and I am free and God is free. So when our freedoms oppose each other, whose freedom wins? I don't think there's a third way on this one. You've got to answer one or the other. And if this is making you uncomfortable, well, welcome to the world of the divine decree model, which feels like the answer to this question is indeed one of the premises of the ways to think about the divine decree view. Those who would believe in God's meticulous providence in all of history would have absolutely no problem answering this question. And indeed, this is the way that they would be conceiving of the problem. So these are just kind of warm-up questions. I invite you to sit on this, and we're going to review the question at the end of the presentation again. So the definition of the divine decree model. God has exhaustive, definite foreknowledge of all future events because God has decreed all future events. This would also be for past and present events too. The basis of God's knowledge, it's God's decision to, in the words of Jean-Luc Picard, make it so, down to the tiniest detail in eternity past. So every single thing that takes place is part of God's decree. And so that is why God knows what is going to happen, what is happening, and what has happened, because it is all part of the plan that God is enacting out. It's known by a few other names. Meticulous providence, meticulous being an emphasis on those tiny details. Every single last bit is part of God's decree. It's sometimes called theological determinism. I would blanch at that a little bit, but you will sometimes hear it by that name. Predestination is another one. I would be okay with that point, with that label on it. You might also hear it called the Augustinian or the Calvinist view or the Reformed view. So this goes by many names, but I decided to name it the divine decree view so that it was clear what it was about. Because if I called it the Augustinian Calvinistic view, I'm not sure if any of you would really understand what I mean. So historically, this is part of the Reformed systematic theology. So Reformed coming out of the Reformation, this would be a theology dated to medieval times, 1415, 1600s is when this was developing a lot, and associated with Luther and then mainly Calvin. But, in response to the excesses in the medieval Roman Catholic Church, there was a Protestant Reformation. And in the development of the Protestant theology, this view of sovereignty was elevated, particularly as it comes to the question of salvation. So this was the view that emerges from the belief that God is sovereignly electing those who will be brought to faith in Jesus, and those who will not. It's the dominant view in, again, the Reformed or Calvinistic tradition. So Presbyterians, which, since we are doing this for the First Presbyterian Church of River Forest, congratulations, your tradition falls within this model. I would say the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and the Presbyterian Church in America are going to be unashamed in their declaration of this view of God's sovereignty. The Presbyterian Church USA, PCUSA, is ambiguous as it is on most things, except for some of its theologically liberal tendencies, which are entirely unambiguous. The PCUSA still says they derive their theology from these confessions. However, I think in practice in PCUSA churches, it is very hit and miss how this is lived out. But if you were going to go to an Orthodox Presbyterian, PCA, probably Evangelical Presbyterian, I would suspect we could ask Pastor Detterman about ECO, the Evangelical Covenant Order, as to where they would fall. But traditionally, the word Presbyterian has been associated with this point of view. Really, also any other denomination or tradition with the word Reformed in the title. The Reformed Baptists, you would come across some Episcopals or Anglicans who would describe themselves as Reformed. That's where you're going to find this point of view. Some notable theologians. So historically, we've got a lot. Augustine, so one of the church fathers. John Calvin, obviously, if it's associated with Calvinism, you'd expect Calvin. John Knox, the founder of Scottish Presbyterianism. Once again, you'd expect that. Jonathan Edwards, the probably king of American theologians. And then contemporary theologians. You're going to find this in the writings and preaching of Tim Keller, John Piper, and R.C. Sproul. I would say all of them would be unashamedly believers in this point of view. You'll have R.C. Sproul and John Piper doing hours upon hours upon hours of lectures on this. So this is, gotta tell you, pretty good list. And as a foreshadowing, that's the word I'm looking for, of what we're going to get to, you look at this list, And just think to yourself, before you're, if you're struggling with this point of view already, before you're going to throw it out the window, look at this list here and say something has to be very convincing to these particularly accomplished theologians, that there's at least something here to consider. So to give a little bit more history behind it, I thought I would bring in the Westminster Confession of Faith. So one of the, this was derived in England, Westminster, when they thought that they needed to come up with essentially a creed, a catechism and a confession about what the church believed. And in there, Article 3 of God's eternal decree contains what I think would be one of the best summaries of this point of view, one of the most famous as well. So in Article 3, it says, God from all eternity did, by the most holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. So I want to emphasize a couple things here. From all eternity, all the way back, God freely and unchangeably ordained whatsoever comes to pass. So what God decreed in the past, freely and foreordained unchangeably, is exactly how things are playing out through history. So that's the declaration. And then following this up, yet so is thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. We will get to that second part a little bit later when we engage the question on God's relationship to sin and evil. But this is, this is the statement from the Confession of Faith that underlies the Presbyterian tradition. Another good way to describe it, Calvin himself. We also note that we should consider the creation of the world so that we may realize that everything is subject to God and ruled by his will, and that when the world has done what it may, nothing happens other than what God decrees. This is where I decided to pull the idea of divine decree from. Nothing happens other than what God decrees. Not a single thing. Put in a bit more contemporary language, theologian R.C. Sproul, probably one of the most... I appreciate Sproul because of his clarity on this. If you want to hear somebody who's really good at describing simply and clearly what this doctrine is about, 50 minutes of a lecture that goes by like 5 minutes because it's so easy to follow, I would recommend R.C. Sproul. His summary here: if there is any part of creation outside of God's sovereignty, then God is simply not sovereign. If God is not sovereign, then God is not God. If there is one single molecule in this universe running around loose, totally free of God's sovereignty, then we have no guarantee that a single promise of God will ever be fulfilled. So this is a very strong view that if there's anything that God is not in charge of, that is not underneath the auspices of the sovereign God, then God simply is not sovereign over the world. So that's the view. That's everything is essentially determined by God through God's eternal decree from eternity past. So where I put this on the spectrum then, all the way down there on the God's control quadrant. There's a little bit, again, I didn't put it on the axis, just like with simple foreknowledge, I didn't put it on the axis. There is some there for human freedom, and we're going to talk about that. But as far as where this falls, think of this as sort of the opposite of the passive simple foreknowledge we talked about last week. There is no model that is more active on God's part than the divine decree model, because God's knowledge of the future is because of God's decree. So where do we see this in the Bible? There's actually a bunch of places, and I'm trying not to exhaust myself with too many verses, but I felt like I needed to bring in a lot of these examples. Because we as Americans, let's be upfront about it. We don't like this. We stand for liberty. We stand for freedom. And what do you mean God decrees everything? We don't have a king. So I think it's important for us to get into the scripture and look at what it says and contend with it. So we talked about this verse early on. In the first class, we'll talk about it again here. For I am God, there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my purpose shall stand, and I will fulfill my intention. This is actually one of the verses that is referenced in the Westminster Confession of Faith for that part that we read earlier, that summary, God's eternal decree. Looking at this real quick, so declaring the end from the beginning and saying, my purpose will stand, I will fulfill my intention. So I want to focus on those words, purpose and intention. So God has a purpose. God has an intention. In the end, which fulfills God's purpose and God's intention, is declared from the beginning. From ancient times, what's yet to come to pass, things not yet done. So declaring the end from the beginning, in parallelism then here, from ancient times, things not yet done. So again, from the beginning, the things that have not yet come to pass, saying, my intentions will be accomplished. So God has intentions, and from the beginning has declared the end to fulfill God's intention. So that would be one verse that would go to support this idea. How about this one from Job? A person's days are determined. You have decreed the number of his months and have set limits he cannot exceed. So think about this for a second. So first of all, yes, it uses the word determined and decreed, but a person's days are determined. So think about this. Every single person would have the number of their days decreed and determined by God. How do people go? So many different ways. Some people go by what appear to be the free decisions of others. Whether accidental, like they make a free decision to turn left and turn left into the far right lane, and they end up hitting somebody who is turning right, hit into a guardrail. So doesn't have to be murder, but it can be a free choice. Or one's free choice, again, to pick up your phone while you're going 70 miles an hour and not notice the pedestrian. Those are, somebody could go via disease. They can make a free decision to go someplace. This might be, something we would think about now. You would make a free decision to do something that would put you at risk, and then you'd contract a disease, and then you may not survive that disease. Those things appear to be free decisions, right? And yet the Bible says the person's days are determined. God has decreed the number of each person's months, and have set limits that a person cannot exceed. The only way that you could reconcile those things is to understand God having a decree, and God decreeing the way in which somebody will depart from this world, despite whether that takes place through agency or not. Here's another one, Ephesians 1:11, one of the most plain ways that it's said. In him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. My emphasis here is a little bit less on the word predestined. I think the stronger point of view is in the end, who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. Everything means everything. And conforming to the purpose of his will means what it says. So it's according to the plan of him, being God, who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. So if everything works out in accordance to the purpose of God's will, tell me about the things that don't work out in accordance to the purpose of God's will. The text seems pretty strong. Proverbs 16 has quite a lot. I pulled out 3 iterations of that. To humans belong the plans of the heart, but the answer of the tongue comes from the Lord. In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. So here, once again, we have plans. Plans in our hearts. We plan our future. But what ultimately affects what happens? It's God. God even determines the words that we say, the steps that we take. And then this last one here, the lot is cast. Remember, casting lots, this is a chance game. That was used, think of it like drawing straws. The lot is cast, so what appears to be random chance to us, yet every decision is from the Lord. So the way that Proverbs is describing it is that even when we have our own intentions, God's plan is the one that prevails. There's a couple other I want to go into, and I need to summarize this because the story of Joseph in Genesis has one of the most important stories about this. It starts to develop this further, how this actually takes place. So it goes from Genesis 37, I think, through Genesis 50. So I'm going to summarize a bit and then get to the punchline, which you may already know, Genesis 50:20. But let's talk about the story of Joseph from Genesis. So Jacob, son of Isaac, son of Abraham, loved Joseph more than the rest of his sons, and this spurred jealousy amongst Jacob's sons. So everybody was jealous of Joseph. Now, initially, they desired to kill Joseph, but instead the brothers decide to sell him into slavery. Joseph goes to Egypt as a slave, skipping over quite a lot. He gains notoriety for his ability to interpret dreams. He was actually imprisoned, and he's brought out of prison because he's able to interpret a dream of Pharaoh's. He becomes a vizier of Pharaoh in Egypt. Joseph then presides wisely over an upcoming famine. So Joseph sees a famine coming. He interprets it from a dream. So he saves food for 7 years of plenty, so that in the 7 years of famine, there is enough food. Joseph's brothers then come to Egypt for food during the famine twice. Joseph recognizes them, sends them home with food. They come back again. This time, Joseph identifies himself to the brothers. They get their father Jacob. Everybody returns to Egypt. And then after Jacob's death, the brothers fear Joseph is going to turn on them and repay them for the evil that they did selling him into slavery. Joseph responds with a very famous line. And that line is, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." So you meant evil against me. God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. I want to point out here the dual intention. As for you, you meant evil, but God meant it for good. So there's a single action here, but there's two intentions. On the part of the brothers, evil. On the part of God, good. And what was the good intention of God? We actually see it here. To bring about the present result, to preserve many people alive. So we have to understand that God has delegated the running of the world to us. This goes back to Genesis 1 and 2. We are God's surrogates in the world. We're the imagers of God. We reflect God into the world. We're supposed to wisely steward over the world. God uses human beings as means to accomplish God's ends. So when God is preserving many people alive in Egypt, it's not being done through some kind of magic that, there's a famine everywhere, but not in Egypt. Instead, God uses Joseph, and then through Joseph, God brings right rule to Egypt, and then that results in a bountiful harvest that they choose to save in order that they have enough food to get through the famine. That was God's intention. The brothers' intention was jealousy. The brothers' intention was to get at Joseph. So the same action, selling Joseph into slavery and lying to Jacob about the fate of his son, had two motives. On the part of the brothers, evil. On the part of God, to put Joseph in place as the means to the end of surviving the famine and bringing Jacob's family into Egypt. For the next part of the divine drama, the Israelites in Egypt. So the point here is that God can have good intentions in evil actions. Some people say in this one that God brought good out of evil. And while that's true, I don't really think that goes far enough with the text. God intended the action to bring good out of evil. It was a plan. This wasn't a reaction. God didn't say, "Oh man, they sold him into slavery. What am I going to do now?" No, you meant it for evil. God meant it for good. And that has to be understood here. Another thing worth saying too, I don't think I have this on the slide. I suppose I'm about to find out as I advance to the next one. But initially the brothers wanted to murder Joseph, but they didn't. Instead, they were, Judah, decides, what, this wouldn't be a really good idea. How about we sell him into slavery anyway and pretend we killed him? Or not we killed him, excuse me, pretend wild animals killed him. We're going to get to this later. God's hand of restraint. The brothers didn't do what they wanted to do. Instead, their sinful desires were channeled not into murder, but into selling into slavery to get Joseph into Egypt as the means by which the famine was survived. So God's hand of restraint resulted in this, and that was the intention of God. All right, let's look at another example. Acts 4:27. For in this city, in fact, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, gathered together against your holy servant Jesus. This is Peter's sermon, whom you anointed to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. So again, the Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles in Israel, gathered together against your holy servant Jesus. So everybody was gathered against Jesus. You're anointed. Gathered against Jesus, you're anointed. And they gathered together against your holy servant to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. So coming against Jesus was part of the predestined plan. This is another place where there's one action, two intentions. So here's a question for you. Was not the unjust execution of the sinless, spotless God-man Jesus the worst sin that has ever been committed? It was completely unjust that the incarnate deity was murdered in human flesh. And yet this was something that God predestined. God predestined the worst sin ever would be committed for the purpose of the redemption of the whole world. So there was clearly evil in the hearts of the people who turned to Jesus over, and yet this was God's redemptive plan. So the theological argument can be made that God is not beyond predestining evil for a particular purpose. Now, God's predestining this, the action itself and the intentions of those people were evil, but God's intentions were good. Just like in Genesis 50:20, you meant it for evil, God meant it for good. Here's another one, different take now. This goes to the question of human freedom. So we're now going to the night of Jesus' betrayal. So they'll all become deserters because of you. I will never desert you. This is Peter speaking. Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, this very night, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, even though I must die with you, I will not deny you. And we know how the story ends. We talked about this in week 1. Peter does, in fact, do exactly as Jesus said. Here's a question for you. Can God know a falsehood? So if Peter was truly free to not deny Jesus 3 times before the next morning, then Jesus has made a false prophecy. But think of all of the free decisions that needed to go into this. Peter had to choose to go somewhere where he could be challenged. Could have just hunkered down. Others who recognized him had to choose to go to the same place. Many people chose to go. Many more people chose not to go. Those people chose to go. Those were also people who would have seen Peter and would recognize him. All of them, upon recognizing him, had to choose to challenge Peter. How many people recognized Peter and didn't say anything? We'll never know, but there was a volitional act to choose to challenge Peter. So then he had to be challenged on those occasions and then had to choose to deny as opposed to affirm or obfuscate, despite being warned. So Peter had been warned, and yet he had to choose not to affirm it, not to be silent, but to actually deny. So look at how many free choices had to go into this, and yet it happened exactly as Jesus said it would. I will say, hopefully none of us think we would have done any better than Peter. I certainly don't. Okay, so the conclusions that would come from all of this. Number 1, God knows the future and can prophesy about the future because God has decided the future and works all things according to the counsel of his will, like the Westminster Confession says, like Ephesians 1:11 says. All things under this view means all things, everything. like Dr. Sproul said, not a single rogue molecule in the entire universe. Human evil, therefore, is part of God's plan. We may not know at the time or ever why God's plan includes that evil, but God's purposes are always holy and good. This is illustrated from the Genesis story of Joseph. This is illustrated by why God would decree the crucifixion of Jesus was a holy and just plan. So human evil is part of God's plan. Natural evil and suffering are likewise the same. We don't know why God has allowed those things to happen or has decreed that those things would happen. But from the biblical examples, the Reformed theologian would say God has a holy and just purpose in those things taking place. So this is associated with the Calvinistic Reformed view of salvation too, in terms of human freedom, where the elect are chosen by God alone, saved by grace through faith, because faith in this view is a gift from God, and this not of yourselves, such that none can boast. So there's, on the question of human freedom, like we described at the beginning, this view would emphasize the sovereign grace of God and not really care that much about protests from humans about their freedom, because they say, one of the sola that was added on to the four solas of the Reformation by the later Calvinists, the soli Deo Gloria, to the glory of God alone. That's a really good overarching idea here. In fact, I have a textbook that it's called Exploring Protestant Traditions. In each one of them, it gives a headline, like a catchphrase that describes the orientation of that tradition. And for the Reformed tradition, the title of the chapter is To the Glory of God Alone. So that's the way to think about it. God is God and I am not. So at this point, we will discuss, and you can think to yourself, what questions or criticisms do you have? Typically, I would say there's a couple that come up pretty much right away when discussing the Reformed view. And we're going to call this part of our theological stress test. The first one is, with apologies to the Westminster Confession of Faith, this does make God the author of sin. That is probably the number one objection. Other forms of it would be that, God, even if you back off from the author of sin, or if you generalize even, you say, God is the progenitor of all evil and suffering in the world. So everybody who experiences evil, everybody who experiences suffering is doing so at the hand of God. God is therefore, what they would call a moral monster. And this is no God worthy of worship. So that's one objection that comes through. And the other one is our lived experience is that we make free choices. We experience our freedom. So what's all this year talking about divine control? We are free. And God gave us free will for a purpose. God gave us free will in particular for us to have genuine relationship. So those would be kind of the 2 points of view that would come up as objections to this idea of the divine decree view. Okay, so let's dig into these two. Is God the author of sin? That's one of the primary objections that comes up. So if God decrees whatsoever comes to pass, then God decreed the Holocaust. God decreed the sacrifice of children to Moloch. God decreed the creation of Satan, his adversary. God decreed deadly earthquakes and tsunamis. God decreed the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the fallout associated with that. And critics would argue that this is just completely inconsistent with the character of God. That if this is really true that God decreed all these things, then God is actually not a good God at all, is what they would say. And, I don't think I need to really belabor verses that would say this is not characteristic of God, but just as one example, 1 John 3, 9 through 10, those who have been born into God's family do not make a practice of sinning because God's life is in them. So they can't keep on sinning because they are children of God. So now we can tell who are children of God and who are children of the devil. Anyone who does not live righteously, does not love others, does not belong to God. So this right here is saying all of this stuff is just the opposite of God. So how could it come from God if it is the opposite of God? That's the way the argument goes. So the question would be, how does the divine decree view respond to this point of view? So they would if you're going to argue this is completely contrary to God's nature to decree sin, death, and destruction, this brings me back to what I was saying earlier, which is you have to know that the theological giants that we talked about before, Augustine, Calvin, Jonathan Edwards, were not blind to this question. You're not the first person to think this. So how do we think those people would answer? What would be the response given by those who favor this model of foreknowledge? So I think the answer would come to you in kind of a twofold manner. The first one is that this problem is a problem for all systems. It is not a unique problem to the divine decree view. So the first response is going to be, it may seem as if this is a unique problem to the divine decree view when in fact it is not. And so all systems have to deal with this problem. So even though that doesn't deal with the problem itself, the first response is going to be, this is not unique. The divine decree view, if this objection destroys the divine decree model, it probably destroys the Arminian model as well, probably destroys the Molinist model as well. The open model actually can get away with some things, not all of it. And then they would say the advantage of the divine decree view is that God has a holy good purpose behind every action. To put this another way, in the divine decree view, there's no such thing as purposeless evil or purposeless suffering, whereas there would be in these other more passive places. And so it is less consistent of God's character to allow meaningless evil than to have a holy and just purpose behind it. So both the divine decree view and the simple foreknowledge view, for instance, say that God infallibly knows the future, including all the suffering and evil that's going to take place, and that God is powerful enough to stop it. The views diverge because the simple foreknowledge view, being passive, does not have any purpose or of God in that suffering, and God lets it happen anyway. So remember we talked about this last time. God creates, and then at the moment of creation, God knows everything because of the time telescope, the difference in perspective. So God knows all of the actions that are going to take place, and then God chooses when to intervene and when not to intervene. So, you could argue it two ways. You could, in one sense, when I hear that, I think, how different is that from the divine decree view? Because God is deciding when it's appropriate to intervene and when not. But, if you say that's not the case, so God knows right away but doesn't intervene, just kind of passively understands everything that's going to happen, then God is simply saying, oops, ouch, that's really bad. But even though God doesn't want it to happen and God's powerful enough to stop it, God doesn't do anything about it. The divine decree view escapes this by saying it is happening for a reason. That's a defense that's derived from Scripture. So like Joseph in the crucifixion, they believe that there's a holy and righteous purpose of God behind each action. This distinction is sometimes also called the primary-secondary cause distinction. So if you remember back in the Westminster Confession, I said we would get to this phrase, neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creature, nor is the liberty of secondary causes taken away, but rather established. So what's a secondary cause? What does this word mean? It's not something we use typically. So think about it this way. God is the primary cause of everything, the ultimate reason that it takes place. Nothing happens except for that which God wants to take place. Humans are the secondary cause, the things through which it ultimately happens. So, if God wants me to, raise my right hand, the primary cause of that is God's decree that I raise my right hand. The secondary cause is me raising my right hand. So it's mediated through that. Here's the reason why this matters. In the Reformed doctrine and, kind of the history of philosophy, these secondary causes also have their own will, their own intentions, and their own desires. Follow me here. This is going to get deep. According to the Reformed view, God does not force anybody to sin. God actually is actively restraining the evil of humanity. And when evil is allowed through or sin is allowed through, it's for a specific purpose. So, we get this idea sometimes that the divine decree model is sort of just like a bunch of robots. It is not robotic. It's really important that this come across, because I think it's a mischaracterization, but it's also hard. It's hard to grasp at first. God's control is through constraint and through restoration of the will, not by making people do that which they otherwise would not, unless it's actually a restraining of the evil. So it relies heavily upon a topic we're going to cover more in week 6. This is the doctrine of total depravity, which states that the radical corruption of the human will is such that we are, by nature, haters of God. It is only then by a unilateral and unconditional act of God that we are redeemed. There's a couple scripture passages here that God's control is through constraint, not through force. So 2 Thessalonians 2 talks about the secret power of lawlessness is already at work, but the one who now holds it back will continue to do so until he is taken out of the way. I know I'm ripping this right out of context, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to read the whole chapter. But from here, you get the idea that God is holding back the power of lawlessness. We see this take place, actually, in Genesis chapter 20. God speaking to Abimelech about not taking Sarah as his wife. So remember, Abraham and Sarah run into Abimelech, asks, who is Sarah? She's my sister. Abimelech takes her to be his wife. Then Abimelech gets a dream. God says to him, I know you did this with a clear conscience, so I have kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Interesting. I have kept you from sinning against me. This God's hand of restraint was put upon Abimelech for a purpose. And the hand of restraint goes on all the time. So the way that the Reformed view is going to think is often what God is holding back way more evil from happening than is coming through. And when it comes through, it's for a reason. So to give an example, Israel was, despite the covenant with God, persistently idolatrous. We know this right away, golden calf. The Reformed view is that Israel was acting freely in committing idolatry. God removed the hand of restraint and allowed them to act out what God knew they would act out for a purpose. Israel was not forced to sin. They did exactly what they wanted to do freely. God knew what they were going to do, and God had a purpose, the demonstration of his justice, but also the demonstration of his mercy in the restoration of Israel. According to the Reformed view, though, they are still responsible for their sin because it was freely done. Okay, so the other thing that we see as a common objection is we make free choices, right? Our experience every single day is that we're making choices that are free. They're not controlled. And in the Bible, we see this too. People are defying God's will all the time. So if we're making free choices, then we are not controlled. So how do we think the divine decree view would respond to this idea of us making free choices? So I think the common response is going to be there's a difference between free choice and free will. We do make free choices, but our choices are not the result of us choosing what to choose. We're the product of internal motivations that we don't control. There's a quote from, I first heard it from the psychologist Jordan Peterson. We are not masters in our own house, describing this relationship between us and ourselves. So for example, do you choose what you dream about? I suppose some lucid dreamers would say that they can gain control, but the scene is still set before they realize that. Have you ever had the experience of a thought just popping into your head? Or can you turn it off a la Book of Mormon, force yourself to stop thinking or feeling a certain way? The answer is no. We're human. We know this. These things emerge and we react to them. We're a bundle of motivations and competing personalities. We don't even choose what we're interested or uninterested in. Have you ever had a hard time paying attention to something uninteresting? Like, I don't know myself. Things that really motivate you, you put yourself towards very eagerly. Things that don't, you procrastinate on. Even when you know you shouldn't. Because you can't control that feeling. Now, it's called discipline to overcome that. But the very fact that you have to overcome something presupposes that there's something to overcome. And that thing is something you don't control. Our sinful motivations are abundant. They're constrained by God for a purpose, and they're loosed by God for a purpose. And we Christians believe that God gives us a new nature, one that by which we can begin to freely choose God. Indeed, we may actually want to choose God. But this idea, we can choose what we choose, and we can choose what we will, but we cannot will what we will. So the will, the motivations, the desires, the impetuses within us are givens, and choice operates on what is presented to it by the will. In other words, we are not as free as we think we are. And in fact, if we have a totally depraved understanding of human nature, then we see how our corrupted sin nature is the thing that is determining the choices that we choose from, or the options from which we choose. So this is something that's not just from religious thinking. This also comes up very much in the psychoanalytic school of psychology. Carl Jung writes about this a lot. Like I mentioned before, Jordan Peterson, the same thing. So the response to free choice is that, yes, we make free choice, but your free choices are not as free as you think they are. And indeed, I think this is consistent with like the story of Joseph, where we see God letting some desires come out, but then also applying a constraint to them to achieve a particular end. So I think that's how the divine decree view is going to respond here. So I want to ask you again to contemplate this question. When my freedom opposes God's freedom, does my freedom win or does God's freedom win? I want you to ask yourself that. So that's all for now. That's the divine decree model. And I hope you enjoyed this one. We're going to go over the openness model, which is going to be very much the opposite of this next week. But again, thank you for tuning in. Please give this a like. It helps the channel. And as always, God bless.